This is Right to Life Radio. And now, here's your host, John DeRoe.
Well, we've got a terrible piece of legislation introduced in Congress, and it has to do with the topic of IVF. We're going to get into this. We're going to explain what's the ethical problems wrong with IVF, the terrible things that are involved in this new piece of legislation introduced actually by Senator Ted Cruz. Here on the show to talk about it with me, we have been covering this issue pretty extensively on Right to Life Radio, is my good old buddy, Mr. Jonathan Keller from the California Family Council. How you doing, Mr. Jonathan?
Not too bad. How about yourself, John?
I'm hanging in there. Senator Cruz has given me agita, though, so
That's right.
I want to jump into this. All right, so before we do this, I feel like every time I talk about IVF, I have to kind of give this proviso, so bear with me on this. I understand lots of people of goodwill, including pro-life people, have, in fact, in some cases, done IVF and used IVF in order to conceive children. I am not saying you are a horrible person if you have done this. I am not, and especially if you do not understand the ethical issues that are involved in IVF, or I'm not saying your friend or your cousin or whoever who did IVF is a horrible person. I think there are lots of very serious ethical problems with IVF that 99% of Americans don't really understand. It's a largely very unregulated industry, and maybe the key problem, a key problem with IVF is the fact that as it's practiced in America, it almost necessarily involves the creation of way more embryos than will ever survive.
Yes.
And it can involve sort of eugenic selection processes of, well, let's get the fittest embryo of the bunch to have that one survive and let all the other ones die. It can involve eugenic sex selection. Oh, I only want a boy, so let's kill all the girl embryos. There are all kinds of ethical problems where basically if we believe, as I would assume most of the pro-life community does, that human life is valuable from the moment of conception, that from the moment of conception you have a unique, identifiable individual, human organism, member of the human family, who is identical to you and me and only differentiated in terms of grade of development, basically, and location.
Yep.
And by its sled, its size, its level of development, its environment, and how dependent it is at this moment. There is nothing different about an embryo formed by IVF as opposed to an embryo in the womb of a scared 20-year-old who wants to get an abortion because she's not sure how she's going to support this baby. Everyone in the pro-life movement sort of agrees in the latter case that that embryo deserves the right to life and protection under law and that abortion should be prohibited. But for some reason, there are a ton of pro-lifers who have this complete, like, dueling realities, basically, that embryos over there are precious and worthy of love and respect and protection under law, but embryos over here in an IVF clinic who are either going to be frozen indefinitely or just destroyed, no, they don't have the same rights. They shouldn't have the same rights, shouldn't have the same protection, because I think IVF is just a more socially acceptable thing. Frankly, I even wonder if there's a little bit of classism to it, honestly. Like, you know, who gets IVF? It's
usually
more
wealthy
people with at least
with the
upper middle
means.
class, because it's not cheap. It's usually not covered by insurance. You got to pay out of pocket for it. It's expensive. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into it. But,
I mean, weirdly, John, in some ways, at the risk of offending some of our listeners, but I'm just being honest here. You can throw tomatoes at me. Don't throw them at John.
Okay.
I feel like in some ways, IVF and abortion are kind of like mirror inverse images of each other, in the sense that a lot of times people say, look, yes, abortion has this tragic result that results in the death of all these children, but look at the good that comes out of it. You have fewer...
Someone's able to pursue their education.
People are able to pursue their education. They're not as poor.
Yeah.
They maybe don't have health issues. And also, we don't bring into the world children who might be disabled or in a difficult situation, foster care. They're going to grow up. Statistically, there's the famous study.
It's all these ends justifying the means arguments.
Correct.
And
on the abortion side, it's all about...
on the On the
on
IVF
the
side.
abortion side.
Oh, okay.
On the abortion side, it's about mitigating undesirable outcomes. And then on the IVF side, it's the inverse because it's all about promoting desirable
The one
outcomes.
desirable
right?
The desirable
Which is, look, we know that a lot of children are going to die, but this is going to be a child that's going to be loved. It's a child that's really desperately wanted.
Well, and it is also, though, it's a thing of looking at the good chiefly of the parent.
Correct.
Parents.
Yep.
Not the good of the child.
And this is something that our friend Katie Faust has. She runs a great organization called Them Before Us. If you go to her website, I think it's just thembeforeus.com. And they do a ton of great stuff on this issue. They talk about it sometimes on the issue of parenting and on the issue of whether it's same-sex adoption or surrogacy or things like that. But specifically on IVF, she was part of the webinar that we did a couple weeks ago for California Family Council after the big Alabama decision. And she also just recorded a great podcast with my colleague, Sophia Laurie, on her special This Is a Woman podcast.
Cool.
But, John, that's exactly it. The whole thing is that
it's focused on
the wants of adults.
The fulfillment and wants of adults as opposed to the good of the child. Now, with all that said, there was this brouhaha in Alabama a couple of months ago because the Alabama State Supreme Court said that its wrongful death statute, where basically you sue someone when you are the survivor of someone who has died wrongfully. So this Alabama wrongful death statute, where basically, someone negligently kills your family member, you're able to sue them for wrongful death. This isn't a criminal prosecution for murder or manslaughter or homicide or anything like that. It's you suing them for wrongful death so you can recoup some damages or something for the death of someone you love. Alabama had a case where some guy wandered into an IVF clinic and accidentally dropped, I think it was a test tube or something, containing a bunch of embryos and destroyed a bunch of embryos. The parents of those embryos who died wanted to sue the clinic for negligence for allowing this guy to come in. The Alabama State Supreme Court said, well, our wrongful death statute allows people to sue for the death of a fetus in the womb. So therefore, we don't see any reason why this wouldn't apply to the destruction of a fetus outside the womb. That decision and the reporting on it and the Democrat reaction to it has been blown so wildly out of proportion. The reporting on it and the Democrat reaction to it was almost as if to say, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade has now made IVF illegal. And it's like, no, it's not making IVF illegal. It's just saying, yes, an IVF clinic, if it's negligent, could be sued for wrongful death. That's all it had to say. But Democrats ran on this to say, see, this is what Republicans are doing. They're going to make it impossible to run an IVF clinic. They're endangering IVF clinics.
That's right.
And instead of Republicans just responding by saying, that's not at all what this court decision was about. This court decision had nothing to do with Roe v. Wade, legal abortion, the Dobbs case, anything. It was strictly the Alabama Supreme Court interpreting an Alabama statute, which doesn't even impact Mississippi law, let alone the laws of all the other 50 states. Instead, Republicans were almost going along with Democrats as if, yes, IVF is under attack. And Trump and all these other Republicans were like, well, we need to ensure that
do something about this.
We have to do something. We have to ensure that IVF is totally available freely to everyone in America who wants it. They pressured the Alabama legislature to completely alter their wrongful death statute so that apparently now it's totally fine for an IVF clinic to be completely negligent and let any yahoo it wants walk into their lab and won't be subject to wrongful death lawsuits. Which I'm not sure how that's even pro IVF.
Right.
If
certainly
IVF
not
clinics,
pro-life.
It's certainly not pro even like the parents who want to do IVF, that the clinic doesn't have as much responsibility anymore or as much liability for ensuring that they have safe processes.
And so, to that point, John, I just want to say, that's why, interestingly, after the Alabama legislature did this panicked immediate response that was a total disaster.
Right.
Some of the original plaintiffs in the case against the IVF clinic, they are now challenging this law based on the basis of the Supreme Court case. And they're saying, you're basically invalidating the legal victory that we just won.
Right.
And you're endangering all of our future children.
There's nothing about this that is pro even IVF parent. As much as I think pursuing IVF as a parent is wrong, is wrong-headed, eliminating liability, massively limiting the liability for an IVF clinic does not help out parents. If anything, it harms them. Now, because Trump made this such a big trumpeted thing, it's now almost this bizarre thing where, well, we need to... Trump stated outright, we need to ensure that IVF is protected. And so now we have Senators Cruz-Britt, the U.S. Senator from Alabama, again, Alabama being the epicenter of this idiotic episode that should never have been... This was like a 1-minute news cycle that somehow Republicans have perpetuated. And specifically, I'm blaming Republicans. I'm not... The Democrats didn't introduce this bill. Yep. Democrats haven't gone on these like self-flagellation campaigns. Cruz-Britt, the U.S. Senator from Alabama, and to our enormous chagrin, Ted Cruz, the U.S. Senator from Texas, one of the most prominent members of the U.S. Senate, one of the most prominent like conservative voices in the Senate.
And I'll be honest, my original the candidate that I was voting for in 2016. I mean, I was originally a Rubio guy, and then I was a Cruz guy. I thought he would have been a great president.
Ted Cruz and Cruz-Britt have now introduced a bill to ensure a federal right to access IVF. Now, when we return, I'm going to talk about just how stupid this is on 20 different levels. Even if you think IVF is a good thing, just how stupid this is, just how much this undercuts the witness of pro-life politicians. All of that is next on Right to Life Radio. Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Cruz-Britt have introduced this legislation to make a federal right to have IVF and various kinds of federal protection for people to get IVF. Jonathan Keller from California Family Council here with me.
That's me.
John Girardi from Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. Now, as we discuss this, again, let me just reiterate, I think IVF is very ethically problematic. It involves the creation of far more embryos than will ever survive. It involves, in America, the destruction of a lot of embryos or the indefinite freezing of those embryos. I think this is all very bad. I am not saying every single person who has done IVF is a horrible or evil person. I think a lot of people have great ignorance about the ethical issues involved in IVF. I'm not saying you are a monster. I'm not saying a child created through IVF is a monster. I'm just saying it is very ethically problematic. And if we think that human life is precious from conception to natural death in the abortion context, I don't understand how we can think anything different in the IVF context. Now,
people can be well-intentioned and make very serious, grave moral errors in judgment.
Yeah,
and that's exactly, speaking of which, that's what this bill is.
That's what this bill is. Okay, so Cruz-Britt, U.S. Senator from Alabama, and Ted Cruz, U.S. Senator from Texas, have introduced this bill to give a federal protection to people who want to pursue IVF. I want to talk about all the ways in which I think this is stupid and hypocritical on Senator Cruz's part, most especially. So first of all, as we stated, the obvious cognitive dissonance that is being caused here between that liberals have caught on to and pointed out. So how is it that you think abortion of an embryo is wrong, but the destruction of embryos in IVF is fine? I don't understand. I mean, that is a fundamentally... They are irreconcilable positions.
Correct.
And Cruz and all these Republicans who are supporting IVF are blowing past the complete illogic of their position, just waving at it as they just drive by.
And John,
just completely ignoring it, which I think 100% undercuts whatever legitimate pro-life witness they want to give, whatever legitimate efforts to defend the right to life they want to pursue. How can they reasonably do that anymore?
Well, and John, I think what this does is it's a very bad example of Republicans, in this case, falling into the thing that so often Democrats are accused of and condemned for, which is saying, well, but I meant well. I have good intentions.
That's the only difference, seemingly. I'm not even sure that is a difference between people who pursue abortion versus people who pursue IVF. I think most of the women who want to have an abortion, they don't want to have an abortion. Their reasons for wanting it, their end goals are good.
Right.
They just kind of blow by the means. So if we're going to say that's wrong in spite of good intentions, but this is right because of good intentions, it fundamentally does not make sense. Okay, so there's the fundamental illogic of it. Secondly, from a governance perspective, it is showing the unbelievable amounts of BS that Republicans have been spewing on the abortion decision over the last couple months here. Especially with Trump announcing, I'm not going to pursue any federal legislation to restrict abortion. And the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, Federalist principles prevent me from doing so. The idea that the federal government should only pursue those things directly and laid out in the Constitution, and if it's not laid out, why? That's a 10th Amendment. It's restricted for everyone else. Robert Bork once famously referred to the 10th Amendment as an ink blot. Because basically he was like, how do you necessarily apply it? There's no really sensible way to be sure what exactly the founders meant. So, oh, no, actually, that was the
Ninth Amendment.
That was the Ninth Amendment he said that about. The Ninth Amendment. Anyway, yeah.
But
so that was the Ninth Amendment. Anyway, so there's not a lot of similar, though, to his view on the Ninth Amendment. I think there's... anyway, it's hard to litigate on 9th or 10th Amendment grounds because they're kind of vague and it's kind of hard. And that's why you don't see as much 9th and 10th Amendment litigation as you do, say, 4th Amendment litigation or First Amendment litigation or Second Amendment litigation. Anyway, all right. But basically, you've had all these Republicans saying, no, we're not going to pursue federal abortion restrictions because of federalism, because that, is that really what the government's supposed to do? Okay, fine, fair enough. That's what you think. You really think the Constitution prevents you from pursuing legislation to limit abortion at the federal level, that it should just be left to the states. Okay, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I understand that argument. But don't you-know-what down my back and tell me it's raining. If you're saying that, and for Trump, within the same speech, is then saying we need to enact federal protections for IVF.
Right.
If the Constitution does not give Congress the ability to restrict abortion, how the hell does the Constitution give the federal government the right to promote IVF?
Right.
Answer me that. To guarantee a kind, as Cruz has stated it, a federal right to IVF. I'm just...
It's kind of bonkers, to put it mildly.
I'm just baffled. It makes utterly no sense. And this is why I think most Republicans, when they talk about federalism, and they talk about... And maybe this is more of a me rant as opposed to a Right to Life of Central California approved rant. But let me just say...
Appropriate also for the John Girardi show.
I have a sense that most Republicans don't really give a rat's behind about federalism way deep down. I think they use federalism as an excuse to not vote for things they're uncomfortable voting for. And then they ignore that when it's something they want to vote for.
Right.
So if it's something for them, they go, I helped protect IVF. See, I'm not a crazy pro-lifer. I'm reasonable. Blah, 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 blah. But then on the side, I don't know if we can vote on a 15-week abortion restriction. in spite of the fact that abortion is a multi-state industry. There are companies that provide abortions in more than one state that you know, who's supposed to regulate Planned Parenthood Marmonti, Jonathan? Reno, the state legislature of Nevada or the state legislature of California? I don't know. Maybe if there was some system of government where basically interstate commerce between the various states could be regulated. Oh, wait, that's what
the federal
government is for,
right.
Regulating commerce between the states. Anyway, I just find this
that level of
so
it alone
stupid and not just stupid, dishonest. Just to say out of one side of your mouth, oh, the 10th Amendment, we have to limited government, and well, we can't use the power of the government to do some really good thing like limit abortion or something, but we can totally use it for this other thing that's more popular.
Right.
Like I'm sick of all of them, Jonathan. I want to put them all on a boat and send it out to sea.
And the thing that's tough, John, is that these are supposedly
lovingly as my brothers and sisters in Christ for whom Jesus died on the cross.
These people,
I want them to take a hike in the most loving way possible.
These are supposedly some of our most staunch pro-life champions. Supposedly.
Yeah. Ted Cruz. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll wrap himself in that flag any chance he gets.
And Katie Britt. I mean, very much. I mean, she's a newly elected senator, but she is not from John. It's not like, oh, she's from a squishy, moderate state like, oh, North Carolina. Or, well, she's
not
from.
It's not like she's a Republican from Maryland or Maine or something.
She's from Alabama.
Yeah.
And
which outlawed abortion. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Like it's.
Yes. And John, the thing that's amazing, if you go back to some of the previous conversations that we've had on this show, the reality is, tragically, as we look towards the future of the pro-life movement, the shocking reality is that even now, absent this bill, and absent, federal financial support for IVF, it's already potentially likely that more children are dying because of IVF than because of abortion.
Yes, and that's the thing. I find it hard to take anyone seriously as a pro-lifer if they're at the same time supporting an industry that leads to, the estimates are just wildly all over the place, but at least hundreds of thousands of embryos every year through the IVF industry that are either frozen or destroyed. When we return, we'll talk about what Jonathan and I would do with all of this next on Right to Life Radio. Back with Right to Life Radio, and we're talking through the bill introduced by Senators Katie Britt and Ted Cruz into the U.S. Congress to guarantee a federal right to get IVF, and basically putting all these federal protections around the IVF industry. A curious exercise for a political party full of politicians who are all of a sudden very nervous about whether Congress has any powers to limit abortion. But apparently it has a lot of power to promote IVF, which, again, as we've discussed, there are a lot of ethical issues involved with IVF that I think a lot of people, including people who do IVF. So this is not us blasting you. It's not us blasting your friend or your sibling or your cousin, whoever who did IVF. The huge ethical problems of basically the IVF industry in America that creates far more embryos than can ever reasonably be expected to survive, and consigns hundreds of thousands of embryos at least every single year in America to either indefinite freezing, being held in stasis indefinitely, or destruction.
So John,
including eugenic destruction, because I want a boy. Let's get the strongest embryo. That kind of thing happens. So
before we read through this article, I just want to say, if anyone is listening to this and they're like, well, John, come on, that sounds unreasonable. What family would really be creating just excess embryos for the heck of it. I mean, don't you know that every one of these cases involves a deeply tragic case of infertility where a husband and wife have been trying to have kids for 10 years and the doctors have told them your only chance is if you do IVF, yada, yada, yada. Well, I will...
Something that you and Julia were wrongly told.
Yes. And we rejected that. I'll just say, I'm not saying that we're better than anybody else. I'm not trying to like pat myself on the back, but
it's just that you were informed enough to understand the ethical problems.
Yeah. And like when we were referred...
which I think if everyone did understand, I don't know how many people would necessarily do IVF. Anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
However, tragically, I think there are some people that are at least somewhat informed about the ethical issues, and they don't care because of how our culture has discipled people. So, so the reason you need ethical safeguards is, for example, someone like Paris Hilton. Because there's this whole story that came out, and I heard it referenced again the other day. She really wanted to have a daughter. She decided to go the surrogacy route because she was deathly afraid of pregnancy,
of being pregnant,
and I'm so scared of what could happen. I'm sure no aspect of it has to do with ruining her perfect body. I'm just saying.
Perfect might be an over. All right, all right. I'm being bitchy. All right, then let's continue.
But along the way to creating her daughter,
Paris Hilton as an icon of all feminine beauty, I have thought for years was kind of a little overstated. She's a very attractive woman.
For those of you listening on the radio, I was doing kind of the air quotes when I said perfect.
I just never understood the idea. Oh, Paris Hilton's so hot. I mean, yeah, she's attractive. All right, move on. All right.
The point though is that not only did she engage in surrogacy, but she pointed out that she decided, as she was trying to create a daughter, it ended up creating 20 male embryos along the way.
Wow.
Because she had to do multiple steps of IVF, multiple rounds of IVF.
So flipping the coin, it just came up 20 times. She flipped heads rather than tails or whatever.
Yes.
And that just is what happened to happen.
So she now has her daughter, but her daughter has 20 brothers who are on ice.
Yeah. And they'll either just remain in stasis indefinitely, or at some point she'll stop paying the storage fees and they will be destroyed.
Right.
And that's what these 20 human organisms are consigned to. And so that's the thing. It isn't just people who are infertile. There are all these celebrities now doing this. Kim Kardashian, I think famously for her second 2 pregnancies, both hired a surrogate and you can't really do surrogacy without IVF also. And surrogacy has its own, large body of problems with it. The idea of commodifying a woman's body, paying monetary consideration for basically the rental of a woman's womb. Something that both Pope Francis and, interestingly enough, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, have both called for worldwide bans on surrogacy, which I thought was very interesting.
John, I just have to point out one thing. In People magazine, quote, talking about the fact that they've been trying for a girl,
Paris Hilton and her
husband Carter Rium.
Okay.
Quote, and we've done it 7 times in terms of the retrieval and fertilization process. 7 times. Jeez, I have all boys. I have 20 boys.
That's unbelievable. Anyway, all right.
And I'm sorry, I was wrong, John. I thought that they had a daughter who was born. The rest of the article here, just one line. Being their desire to add a baby girl to the family, they are continuing to make embryos hoping for a little girl.
So they still haven't produced a girl, and they're still creating more embryos. This is the lunacy that we're talking about here. And it is a thing of, okay, if you want a bill that has to do with IVF, there are all kinds of ways to regulate the IVF industry that would eliminate a lot of these problems and at least mitigate the ethical problems involved with IVF. Now, I think beyond the wastage of embryos, which is horrible, I am of the opinion, and this is rooted in Catholic teaching, and I suspect Jonathan probably agrees with this as well. I am of the opinion that the creation of any human embryo, even if there is not wastage, via a process like this, has grave ethical problems as well. I think separating procreation and unity, the two ends of the sexual act. I think there is stuff that is problematic and wrong with that. And by the way, I shouldn't say it's rooted in Catholic teaching. I think there is a natural law argument to say that is something that is wrong. There are ways, though, to regulate IVF at the very least to mitigate the horrible ethical problems involved with this creation of this wastage of embryos, the wastage of embryos, the insane eugenic selection of embryos, a la what Paris Hilton is doing,
right?
A la what Kim Kardashian did with Kanye West when they were married, where their second child, they insisted it had to be a boy because Kanye wants an heir. Which Kanye West is apparently not up to speed on American law, that we don't have heirs.
No,
that's not kind of how the thing works anymore. Yeah. Your daughters are perfectly free to inherit the house. This isn't a Pride and Prejudice situation with a fee tail. We don't do that anymore.
Yep.
Or the daughter has to marry, a guy. All right. Anyway. All right. So let's look at this piece. This was an op-ed. Let me conclude the segment by this, and we'll go to this excellent op-ed in The Hill that was published by Natalie Dodson, sort of critiquing Senator Britt and Senator Cruz's bill. There is at least one state, Louisiana, that actually does have helpful regulations and restrictions and guidelines around the IVF industry to prevent this wholesale mass creation of excess embryos who are all destroyed. Other countries also have regulations in place to limit the creation of excess embryos. A number of countries in Europe have these kinds of regulations. So I guess I'm not saying that any legislation at the federal level dealing with IVF, I mean, if we're going to get away from our pretend objections to, the 10th Amendment and the federal government doing things that it's apparently not supposed to do.
Right.
All right, let's put that aside. There is room for really helpful and good and pro-life regulation of the IVF industry that wouldn't necessarily entail the destruction of the IVF industry.
Right.
But that's not what Cruz and Britt are doing. No. So when we return, we're going to look at this great op-ed written by Natalie Dodson in The Hill, who's a public policy analyst with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is a great think tank in Washington, D.C. We will go through it, learn about the deficiencies in this bill. That is next on Right to Life Radio. Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Katie Britt have introduced legislation to have federal protections for IVF, basically taking a 1-day, 3-day news cycle about the Alabama State Supreme Court saying that, IVF clinics who let random people wander in and destroy embryos can be sued for that, turning that into, oh my gosh, are Republicans trying to ban IVF? Obviously they weren't. To now, we need to pass that the Republican Party has to pass and introduce federal legislation to protect the IVF industry as a whole, which is, I think, insane. The IVF has massive ethical problems involved. Basically, as it's practiced in America, it involves the creation of way more embryos than can ever survive. And what Senator Cruz and Senator Britt are doing is basically, I think, massively undercutting their otherwise pretty good pro-life witness by saying, no, embryos conceived in IVF don't deserve protection. And in fact, this process of letting them be created in a way that doesn't get protection should be protected at the federal level.
Yes.
But children conceived and threatened with abortion, no. That is wrong, but not IVF. So here's a piece in The Hill written by Natalie Dodson about this. She writes, on Sunday afternoon, Senators Ted Cruz and Katie Britt announced an in vitro fertilization bill with two aims. First, it would prohibit any state that receives Medicaid funding from prohibiting IVF, which is one of these things where, like, we're protecting IVF. No state in the union was threatening to prohibit IVF. This is one of these things politicians do that I cannot flip and stand, where, well, see, we helped protect IVF, this thing that was at absolutely zero risk to begin with, other than in the imaginations of Democrats, that thinking that Republicans would want to. And second, the bill would, quote, protect life. But, Dodson continues, when the bill's text was revealed the next morning, nothing about it was pro-life. In their Wall Street Journal article announcing the bill, the senators conclude this is an opportunity to unite on a shared bipartisan commitment to life. Cruz and Britt are wrong. IVF as practiced in the U.S. is not committed to protecting life. In the U.S., IVF regularly involves selective abortion, a procedure which, in other instances, Cruz and Britt have opposed. When asked about whether an IVF embryo is considered life at conception by a Bloomberg reporter during an interview on the bill, Cruz sidestepped the question, deflecting that the issue of abortion belongs with the states. But apparently IVF belongs to the feds. Like
that's right.
They are being so illogical about it. It's unbelievable. He is so full of dirt that his eyes are turning brown. I was trying to think of a different thing that's brown.
It's just the double standard for me, John, that you are telling the pro-life movement, no, due to these very serious concerns, trademark.
Constitutional concerns of the 10th Amendment.
We cannot do this thing that you want to protect life over here. I'm sorry. I wish, if it was up to me, but this is for the good of all of us that we can't do this.
I'm just protecting the Constitution. I'm just protecting the Constitution here.
Yeah.
I don't know about you.
Yeah.
Because the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, it actually reads that pro-lifers should not win. That's actually what it says.
That's right.
Yeah. Pro-lifers can go suck it. That's what it says.
They can never win.
All right. Britt also committed to a pro-life stance when she said, as a Christian conservative wife and mother of 2 precious children, I am proud to be 100% pro-life. Both my faith and the science tell me that life begins at conception, and I'll fight tirelessly to protect life in the Senate. But apparently, the right to IVF would appear to be more precious and fundamental than the right to life. To support IVF consistent with the senator's belief that life begins at conception, Cruz and Britt would need to promote ethical IVF practices that limit the negligent destruction of embryos, which they agree are unborn human lives, selective embryos created through IVF, and the unlimited creation of embryos that are in turn cryopreserved indefinitely. The bill addresses none of these safeguards. While the bill concludes by stating that nothing in the law shall be construed to impede states from implementing health and safety standards regarding the practice of in vitro fertilization, it fails to cover ethical standards that protect life and prohibit sex and disability discrimination. In fact, this bill, which has little nuance, would likely be interpreted to prohibit states from putting common sense safeguards on an unregulated industry. Further, the bill propagates lies about infertility, IVF, and the assisted reproductive technology industry. The bill claims that IVF is an effective and reliable means to achieving pregnancy. But this couldn't be further from the truth. And then she goes on to give the statistics that IVF is not like a super reliable way of conceiving. It's a very difficult, very costly, very invasive process that does not have a great batting average, basically. Women under 35 who undergo an IVF cycle, less than 25% will experience a live birth. As age increases, the percentage decreases significantly. Now, the bill also states that IVF is a pro-woman and pro-family solution for those struggling to have children. It is neither of those things. The assistive reproductive technology industry routinely promulgates, or at least is part of, an inadequate assembly line for women's health. Rather than addressing underlying conditions that cause infertility. This is a really key point.
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding, ding. Rather than addressing underlying conditions that cause infertility, like PCOS, like endometriosis. Most women are immediately referred to IVF clinics where they spend their life savings pursuing a pregnancy that will likely not be achieved.
But hey, the doctors got rich off of it, so.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the reasons why I don't think, properly speaking, we should call IVF healthcare, because it's not correcting anything that's wrong with the body. Yes, you're infertile.
It's a medical procedure.
It's a procedure that it doesn't fix your infertility.
Right.
It sidesteps it to create human beings another way.
Right.
So hence why I think it's legitimately not covered by insurance. It's not really, and we talk about this in the abortion context also, it's not really healthcare in the same way that actually treating something that's wrong with you is healthcare. That's all we've got for it this week. Thank you all so much for listening. RTLCC.org. We'll be back next week with more Right to Life Radio.